Conmen, the most devious of all criminals. Charming, cool and calculating, they betray trust and devastate lives, yet remain a complete enigma. We are about to explore the mysterious world of these master criminals, giving an unprecedented insight into the workings of the complex minds of some of the world's most cunning con men and women. We will reveal the detail and the intricacies of their elaborate crimes and uncover how they were dramatically brought to justice. In this show, we uncover the incredible story behind one of Britain's most prolific and compulsive confidence tricksters, who hid behind the bogus persona of an exceptional yet eccentric Cambridge University professor to habitually and compulsively try to dupe legions of victims out of millions of pounds.
If I had to sum up Robert Haims, I would describe him as a parasitic conman.
Robert Haims posed as a university professor, groundbreaking scientist and even a terrorist to make money and cover his web of lies.
His style worked extremely well.
He told me he was a professor.
The sort of bumbling professor who's very clever but a bit distracted, and he uses the people's reaction to that in order to manipulate them and deceive them.
He had got a plausible explanation for every challenge that you put to him.
A con man so prolific that while on bail, he even went on to con another 81 people out of their hard-earned cash.
He's a very, very convincing liar, as most con men are.
He was a weaselly little man.
He is a classic con man.
Robert Haims was born on the 13th of May 1954 and is a well-educated man with a genuine master's degree in philosophy and science from Warwick University. Up until 1987, Haims worked legitimately as a microbiologist with his scientist wife. After going bankrupt in 1990, his prolific criminal career as a conman began. In 1991, Haims bizarrely hit the headlines. He set up a laboratory in a converted farm building in Essex and went to the press, claiming that working with a Russian research team, he had made a breakthrough in AIDS research and was close to discovering a cure, as these images from the time show him boasting. Haims' claims were unfounded, but this persona of a groundbreaking scientist became Haims' manipulative weapon, used to disarm his victims in order to obtain goods that he had no intention of ever paying for.
The fact that Haims uses this persona of the university professor who's a research scientist developing a cure for AIDS and all the other stories that he came up with, this sort of eminent scientist, creates not only a feeling in people's minds that he's an authority figure, he's very clever, he's somebody to be respected, and conmen do use that sort of character quite often.
We all have prejudices, and if we are looking to be ripped off, then we usually expect that person to, well, maybe not come with a bag that says swag on it and a stripy t-shirt, but we expect there to be something a little bit iffy about that person. Haims presented himself as an upper-class gentleman, a bit of a bumbling professor. And I think that persona was quite disarming, and that persona was something that helped him get away with so much over so many years.
A year later, the bogus professor was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment after he ambitiously conned £236,000 from the farming community. Haims had been obtaining £20,000 to £30,000 loans from different finance companies. He was claiming that the money was to buy farming equipment that either did not exist or he did not own. Haims faced 19 charges of deception in total, which also involved other scams. Haims sold farm equipment he didn't own, pocketing the bogus profit, and also purchased goods with bad checks, a staple theme of his conman career.
He gives the impression that he's from money and money's no object to him, and it works very well when he's dealing with these people. On numerous occasions he would go into normal shops and actually arrange for the delivery of items. Now, well-off people often do that. I know they will go into a shop and say, can you have this delivered to my house? I'll pay you, can I create an account with yourselves? He'll create an account and he'll obtain thousands of pounds worth of goods with never the intention to pay for it. And then these people, after a few months, he'll speak to them on the phone. They'll come to his door, he'll speak to them and he'll make excuses as to why the payment's not been made. He'll write them cheques, which subsequently bounce. or he'll tell them the money transfer has just been made from his bank account to theirs, and he can string them on for months, till eventually they realise that he's conned them.
I think that the kind of lifestyle that he was maintaining would have been enough to give most people a nervous breakdown, and yet this was just the norm to him. So that suggests to me that maybe even there was something in his biochemistry that actually he couldn't get the same level of anxiety. He couldn't have that same level of arousal that the rest of us would get.
Bogus scientist Robert Haims appealed against his conviction for his £236,000 con and had his sentence reduced to just a year. Unlike most con artists who live a solitary life, Haims had a partner and 4 children. Despite his custodial sentence, Haims' family stood by him during his prison term, and the police believe his partner and 4 children had very little or no knowledge of his consistent conning. But Haims' conning was the key to providing for his family, conning small, in some cases seemingly insignificant amounts of money in order to give his family the best things in life. He leased houses and never paid the rent, hired top-of-the-range cars, racking up bills of £8,000 he had no intention of paying, and duped private schools into educating his children without paying the £5,000 tuition fees. And his family, it seems, were none the wiser.
He has a wife and a family, and yet he's been able to move them around every 6 months or so, renting houses and using unusual checks and methods of payments or disputes, and yet he's still been able to maintain that sort of family life, which is incredibly difficult, and it says a lot about his personality and the hold he has over his family, that he was able to do that successfully without them actually realising quite how he was getting his money.
Even family holidays were the fruits of Haims' criminal career, a fact guesthouse owner Roberta Truin learned firsthand when Haims and his family booked in for a 2-week stay.
We had a cash payment of £300 and they then owed £700.
And while Haims stayed at the guest house, he was keen to ingratiate himself with Roberta.
He would come into my sun lounge for 7, 8 times or more a week about different trivialities. There was something about him I didn't like. He was in my opinion, a weaselly little man.
And as the 2-week stay came to an end, Haims settled the bill like any other customer, only it was all lies and part of his usual practice. Haims had no intention of paying, but it didn't stop him going through the motions and having the audacity to write the cheque out in front of Roberta.
He wrote it out here, and he said, there we go, that's a £700 cheque, is that correct? I said, that's correct. That's the last I saw of them.
It may have been the last Roberta ever saw of Robert Haims, but not the last she saw of his worthless cheque. As soon as he left the guest house, the conman cancelled the £700 cheque, and Roberta was shocked when the bank sent the worthless piece of paper back.
Couldn't believe it. I thought, gosh. I went straight to the police. They took away the cheque.
Although the complaint was logged by the police, Roberta never saw Haims again or had her money refunded.
I didn't ever think maybe he wouldn't pay me. I thought he would. Imagine how you can be conned by people.
In the twisted world of confidence tricksters, £700 may not seem like a great deal of money, but this was the key to Haims' success. He committed individual, small-scale cons on a monumental and almost obsessive scale. Individually, each incident seemed like a civil, not criminal case. But Haims was rapacious. Where he lived, what he drove and what goods he obtained were hoodwinked from unsuspecting victims, leaving trustworthy people like Roberta feeling violated and out of pocket.
It has made me question people who are paying me a cheque. But people are not all like Haims. They're not evil. They're not deceitful. It really is despicable. It's evil.
Coming up, Haims' criminal ambition grows, and he plans to dupe the art world out of over £1 million.
He nearly pulled off what would have been actually a massive heist.
Robert Haims is very different from the sort of Jack the Lad type conman that people associate with scams.
Robert Haims is a calculating career conman who prolifically conned people out of goods and money by posing as a bumbling yet bogusly eccentric university professor.
He creates his own references, his own false documents.
He would look you straight in the eye and say, I don't understand the problem.
Took his family around Britain living in £1 million mansions, all on the basis of forged documents and false claims.
There must be some communication situation between you here and there.
There was something I honestly didn't like about him.
That's just his way of life. He's going to live off other people.
Haims' prolific conman career focused on duping service industries on a vast scale, renting houses and cars for 6-month periods and moving on without paying. The police believe Haims' family were ignorant to his relentless conning, but in 1998, 44-year-old Robert Haims' lies to his family proved to be his undoing. Haims' family believed their academic father and husband had received a position at a leading university in California, and they were moving lock, stock and barrel to the USA. It was all lies. The job was fictional, and so when the day came when the Haims family were due to set off on their new life, Robert Haims audaciously took a drastic action to make sure they could not travel. He created a terrorist alert at Heathrow Airport.
We see actually a little crack in Haims' schemes. Having told his family that they're actually going to move lock, stock and barrel over to California, they're actually not. He never had any plans for them to do so, but ultimately things were going wrong. So he decided that he would ring up Heathrow Airport on 4 occasions, say he was from the IRA, and they had to clear the airport.
Now, for a man who's very practiced at lying, he couldn't just make up a simple lie. He actually went to the extreme of phoning up the airport and saying there'd be mass death and destruction because there was a bomb in the airport.
Haims had phoned Heathrow Airport adopting an Irish accent and left chilling messages and death threats. Haims made 4 calls over 2 hours, contacting the BBC, the Civil Aviation Authority and Heathrow Airport, claiming that there would be widespread death and destruction should the airport not be evacuated.
I mean, I guess he thought, well, I'm trapped. The only thing I could think of is this desperate measure. And most of us wouldn't do that because it's just too outrageous. But if you're a sociopath or, you know, with limited conscience, basically that kind of thing doesn't bother you. You don't think about consequences or anything like that.
Talk about just taking things a step too far. This is a man who routinely lied, and you have to wonder what went wrong on this particular occasion. I think that he must have had a lapse in imagination, that he couldn't think of anything convincing to say to his wife, but what lengths to go to.
Thankfully, of course, the police actually traced those phone calls, as they do on those sorts of scenarios, and he was in fact arrested and sentenced for that crime.
During the trial, a voice expert concluded the twisted hoax calls were made by Haims, and the telephone company traced the calls to Haims' address. It also transpired that Haims had tampered with his phone line during the week after his hoax calls to make it seem someone else had made the calls. Haims pleaded not guilty, but on the 1st of July 1998, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for the bogus calls. As well as losing his liberty, this period also saw him lose his common-law wife, as his relationship ended after his bizarre and dangerous stunt.
Supposedly his wife didn't know. She actually thought he was a professor, which, you know, is testament both to how convincing people can be and how willing people are to be convinced.
In 1999, after being released from prison early, Haims simply continued conning, but this time upped his game and ensured he had the tools to make his fictional conman persona of a biotechnics professor working on cures for cancer and AIDS completely convincing. He bought a fake certificate online.
At some point, people are going to confront Haims, aren't they? They're going to want some sort of proof of what he is. Now, actually, he found that he could buy something that seemed to provide a certain level of proof. He bought a certificate for £200 off the internet, which appeared to claim that he was a professor of a university that actually didn't exist. So it shows a bit of an arrogance to me, but obviously that was useful to him. People believed him.
Haims started a new relationship. Once again, Haims' new partner had no idea he was a compulsive conman. Robert Haims' criminal career focused on conning relatively small amounts from copious victims that left his scams undetected by the police. Each individual and isolated case appeared to be a civil, not criminal matter, but Haims was prolifically conning a whole host of businesses simultaneously. including car rental companies and property letting agents out of thousands of pounds.
He would drive about in brand new Mercedes, 4x4s. He would actually not pay for anything. I've never known him actually pay for anything. He wouldn't pay his council tax, he wouldn't pay his BT bills, he wouldn't pay his electricity or gas. Because he was only at these locations 6 months at a time, he would then move on and never pay any of the utility bills. But he would still maintain, he would still use his same name. So often he would then use his wife perhaps to create new accounts with BT without her knowledge, to be fair to her. She wasn't aware any of this was going on.
But in February 2002, 4 years after his Heathrow bomb hoax, Haims set about executing a multi-million-pound con targeting the art world.
Haims sort of changed his tack slightly, and he decides that he's going to defraud Christie's, the auction house. And he does that by getting a forged document from the Bank of California, which purports to say that he is able to spend up to £5 million. I mean, a huge amount of money, which most people think nobody would have the audacity to go in with and say and forge a £5 million credit note. But basically, that's what he did.
Well, I think that the Christie's incident was really his downfall, because up until then, his scams had been frequent, but fairly small really in the grand scheme of things.
The Christie's scam was not dissimilar to Robert Haims' traditional cons. Haims adopted his usual persona of the well-to-do, bumbling professor who was also a wealthy art collector. But this con, rather than scamming 6 months free rent, was ambitiously attempting to con Christie's out of 6 paintings worth over £1 million. The first phase of the con was to use the fake professorship and the forged American bank reference to convince Christie's he was legitimate. It looked like the bogus scientist was in reach of conning the world's most respected and auspicious auction house. But rather than attending the auctions himself, Haims bizarrely sent his eldest daughter Catherine into Christie's to bid on his behalf. Believing her father to be a successful, renowned and wealthy scientist, she happily sat in the auction room on the phone to Haims and enjoyed the thrill and excitement of the bidding fray.
He nearly pulled off what would have been actually a massive heist. But I think the fact that he was batting outside of his league was actually what gave him away, because of course he'd involved his daughter in the con. She wasn't aware of what was going on.
What he did was to get his daughter, Catherine, to unwittingly go to Christie's on his behalf and, using a telephone bid system, make bids for 6 paintings, which added up to a huge amount of money.
Catherine, blissfully ignorant of the criminal plot she was unwittingly embroiled in, sat and bid on the paintings. On the phone to her father, who was instructing her, she first secured a painting worth over £500,000. And further victories were to follow. Catherine subsequently won 5 more masterpieces for her art-loving father. As far as she was concerned, Catherine had successfully secured the 6 paintings her eccentric academic father desired, even if it had cost him £1,188,000 of his fortune. Catherine had no idea his fortune was fictional, and this was just the second phase of his master plan. The final stage was simply to get Christie's to ship the paintings before he transferred the funds. A trick Haims was a master at, but his innocent daughter was not. Catherine turned out to be Haims' Achilles heel, and his manipulation of her was a huge mistake.
And when she started to mention to Christie's that she was going to put one of these incredibly expensive pieces of work in a frame from a high street shop, that was obviously a bit of a clue that they didn't have the means they professed to have.
Now, clearly that would raised enormous loud bells in the staff of Christie's mind, and they realised what was going on. And as a result of that, the scam just didn't work.
She had broken a cardinal rule of scamming, because of course she wasn't a con artist, which is that she'd effectively broken character. She wasn't keeping up appearances. And I'm sure that he would have, if he'd been doing it himself, he would have known better, because the basic rule is you don't let your guard down like that.
You do find, by and large, that career con men tend to be solitary. They're always described as loners, and that's because you need to cover all bases. If you've got people in your life, then they're people who could potentially give you away unless they are absolutely 100% on board with you. That was a mistake that Haims made. He's daughter didn't know what was going on, and therefore, of course, she couldn't be relied upon.
Conning on such a large scale proved to be out of Haims' league. Not only had Robert Haims' daughter unwittingly exposed him as a fraud, but Christie's, unlike so many other businesses he had duped, were unprepared to hand over the goods without payment up front, no matter how much the bumbling professor insisted the paintings be shipped to him. With no payment from Haims, Christie's were left out of pocket because the paintings eventually sold for £150,000 less than Haims bogusly bid, and they needed to maintain their relationship with the vendor. Christie's called the police. Haims' con had failed, and he knew it was only a matter of time until the police found him, because bizarrely when executing the Christie's con, as with all his other scams, Robert Haims had used his real name.
Certainly most conmen will use different identities in order to carry out their frauds, and he doesn't. It's almost, say, an arrogance that he doesn't care almost that he's going to be found out.
I think it is unusual for a con artist not to use an alias, because most of them are pretty fluid with their names, and I think that's very characteristic about the sort of state of their identity, if you like. They're cavalier with their identities, they're often cavalier with their names.
To evade the police, the bogus professor fled the country. Haims, with his family in tow, travelled over to the USA on the pretense that he had been employed to work on groundbreaking cancer research, leaving his innocent teenage daughter behind to face the music. Unlike the Heathrow scam in 1998, they actually went, and while in California, the family lived in luxury, initially renting a mansion worth £1.7 million that Haims had no intention of paying for.
Not content with conning people left, right and centre in this country, of course Haims, lock, stock and barrel, picked his whole family up and went to live in California, where he went about doing exactly the same things, buying stuff on the Never Never and putting out false cheques and false credit notes, and basically conning the Americans the way he'd conned us.
The British police travelled to the USA in pursuit of Haims for the failed Christie's con.
The Metropolitan Police actually went out there and interviewed him in America for the offences, but obviously their jurisdiction there is non-existent. They have no powers of arrest. The offence for which they were investigating him wasn't sufficient enough to effect an extradition order, so they were forced to return to the UK and await for him to perhaps at some point return to the UK where he would be arrested for the offences.
So safe from British law, Haims was sitting pretty in the Californian sunshine, conning an opulent lifestyle he had no intention of ever paying for. But this wasn't going unnoticed.
He hadn't been arrested out there, but he was being investigated because he was doing the same thing. He was renting accommodations, really good quality accommodations, the sort you would see in California, and he never paid for anything.
After living in the USA for over a year, Haims' successful run of conning free accommodation and cars was coming to an end. The authorities were circling.
He came back to the house and said, we're getting the next flight out. And they did, and they left all their possessions behind. And he told her that he would have someone arrange to have the possessions sent on. That was about the same time that I understand that a decision had been made that he was going to be arrested for offences over there. He subsequently came back to England, so he was never actually dealt with for offences in America.
Coming up, Haims audaciously returns to the UK, and his callous desire to con ravages even more lives.
He would turn around and say, there must be a lack of communication. I cannot understand. I'm waiting for the money to come from my offshore account. Robert Haims is a professional conman. He's a career conman.
Robert Haims is a con artist who has duped people out of tens of thousands of pounds of goods and money.
But it's amazing what you can get away with if people believe that you are an authority figure.
He will use this mad professor routine, and he's fearless.
He was so successful at it that he even fooled his own wife.
He's brought up his family and they've lived successfully on money that's been stolen for years and years and years.
He was full of pretence the whole time, no end to his folly.
And he is a very, very convincing liar.
After going on the run to the USA for his failed 2002 Christie's con, Robert Haims continued conning on the other side of the Atlantic. Haims left the USA in 2003 to avoid arrest, but it was a case of jumping from the frying pan into the fire. He returned to the UK in December and attempted to buy a £2 million house in the Cambridge area. Naturally, Haims didn't have the money and the police became involved. They caught up with the con man, and Haims was finally arrested in January 2004 and charged with the Christie's con. In most con man case files, bar the trial, this would be the end of the story, but released on bail in April 2004, his one-man conning mission became more rapacious than ever.
And what shows the difficulty with investigating con men is that when Haims was actually arrested, he went on, whilst he was on bail, to commit another 81 offences. And that shows you the difficulty that detectives have when they arrest someone for a complicated fraud. It takes a long time to investigate, to compile the evidence and to bring a case before the court. You can't keep someone in custody for an offence like that. So they're out there still, conning people in order to get money to live.
One of the cons Haims executed while on bail for his Christie's con was to audaciously enrol his two youngest daughters into a private school. But in his usual style, he had no intention of paying the £17,000 for the school fees.
When these schools were getting a bit irate, he'd never paid any school fees, numbering thousands and thousands of pounds. He would start to write to them saying, "I'm not happy with the service you're providing, I'd like you to address this, and once that's been addressed, perhaps I'll consider paying the fees." But he was never happy, and eventually it would culminate in him actually withdrawing his kids from the school without any payment and placing them at another school. So in its own, if that was reported to the police might say, well, this is not a criminal offence in isolation, you're going to have to resolve that directly with him via solicitors. But it's only when you put them all together that you realise then that he's got a very dishonest trait with regards to his deceptions.
But his cons did not always benefit his family. Awaiting trial, Robert Haims unbelievably targeted Catherine, his student daughter from a previous relationship. Not only had Haims already callously and cruelly implicated his innocent daughter in his doomed Christie's con, but he then went on to destroy her life by putting her £12,000 in debt. He stole his daughter's checkbook and decimated her account and overdraft.
She went off to university. He got hold of her checkbooks from her bank account and wrote and bounced every single cheque from that account. And it went up to about £10,000 or £12,000. She, as far as she was concerned, that bank account had been closed because she'd asked her father to close that bank account because she no longer needed it. And the next thing she heard was she started getting letters from the bank demanding in excess of £12,000.
Now, most of us would not do this to somebody that we love, but I imagine that actually he didn't really think it was much of a big deal. So what? He's been in debt his whole life. It obviously doesn't faze him, so maybe he just assumed that it wouldn't faze her either.
She was very distressed about this. As you can imagine, being a student, not only was she distressed about it, but the banks didn't believe her that her father had stolen the money, and they were pressing her. And they started pushing her with warrants and demands and bailiffs. She was very distressed over that, and that went on for many, many months. She doesn't speak to her father anymore, as you can imagine.
And Catherine was one in a long, long list of victims. Despite the fact Haims was released on bail, waiting for a trial date, and almost certainly facing a custodial sentence, his crimes continued. Haims' criminal activities funded and supported his and his family's lifestyle. And shops, car rental companies, letting agents, hotel and guest houses were all duped by Haims in the Cambridge area. He was obtaining their services but not paying. And one of Haims' victims contacted DC John Gibbons.
I first came across Robert Haims when I picked up a small inquiry in relation to a non-payment where he'd stayed he'd rented a small house for a couple of weeks. It was in our local area and he hadn't paid. He'd basically just left without paying. She reported it to the police, we investigated it, and it really began to snowball from there, from a simple little job like that. I was linking up with other officers from our own force who were also investigating him independently for hotel stays, non-payments, and I picked up all the jobs together from Suffolk, thinking he was a fairly small-time criminal.
Haims' incessant conning spree was taking place while he was still awaiting trial for his 2002 Christie's con, which was being delayed because Haims was claiming ill health.
He would feign illness, check himself into a hospital the day before he was supposed to be at court, and clearly the judge, who wished to stay on the case from the beginning to the end, was getting quite annoyed with him.
But ill or not, he continued to con, shockingly committing over 80 offences whilst on bail. This prolific spree included attempting to con a local shop out of £7,000 worth of goods, refusing to pay his £8,000 bill for a car rental, and duplicitously opening a bank account with false details, then spending the £12,500 overdraft. On the surface, duping relatively small amounts of money from small businesses and banks, Haims was insatiable, and his cons sustained a comfortable lifestyle and the appearance of a successful and groundbreaking professor.
He would open bank accounts using false references, using his own names, and he would obtain as many checkbooks as he could. Now, most people will have 1 or 2 checkbooks running at one time. He would he would say he'd lost his checkbook, so he would end up getting 5 or 6 checkbooks with 30 plus checks in there. And then once he thought he'd got sufficient amount of checks, he would then start bouncing those checks. Because obviously he'd got sufficient checks, the banks would, at some point, would realise that these accounts are thousands of pounds in deficit, and they would shut the accounts down. But at that point, he's got sufficient amount of checks to continue with his deceptions. This is where the losers lose out, the actual victims, because they accept a cheque from him. If the bank account is closed, they have lost. There's no doubt about that. They've lost their money. Because of his persona again, the way his style, the way he behaves, they would take big cheques from him without cheque cards. So clearly they would lose. A simple way to con people, and it's a common way of conning people, and he would use that. His other way, which is quite common, but he did it very well, he would have half a dozen bank accounts running from all the major banks, and it's called cross-firing. He would cross-fire cheques, large amount of cheques, for £500,000, £750,000. He would write a cheque from one account for £750,000 and deposit that into another account. That then shows up on his account that of £750,000. So on occasions, if he was struggling with conning people, he would go into somewhere and say, I've just printed this off. Here's my bank statement, it's got £750,000 in it. I'm not a problem, here's a cheque for £10,000. It's not a problem, you'll get your money. Soon after, obviously that £750,000 would go out as a deficit because the cheque would have bounced, because the cheque that the account he wrote it from obviously didn't have insufficient funds. He would contact the bank managers and keep that going for months and persuade them that there is large sums of money coming in from offshore accounts, but they would never arrive.
Robert Haims' appetite for living by fraudulent means was unquenchable. His litany of small-scale scams continued, leaving behind a long list of victims left out of pocket and feeling violated and foolish.
And a number of people have said, I saw him pull up in his brand new 4x4 Mercedes. He appeared to have come from some money. His address was a good quality address. I maybe had some reservations about giving him whatever he was after, but he convinced me otherwise. You would hear this time after time. It's all in, it's in their statements, and it did make them feel very silly and embarrassed. And there are still some who never came forward. They didn't want the police or the press to know how badly they've been conned.
One of the problems with con artists, and one of the reasons why it's profitable to practice it and why people do it, it's very hard to police, because often we're talking about relatively small sums. Often it's quite a sort of a grey area because they haven't actually broken in somewhere and robbed something. Obviously, in the real world, you are allowed to have things on credit, and there is a delay between when you get something when you pay for it. You can take a car back after a certain period of time, so you're not happy with it, I'm not going to pay for it. And if they don't like it, they can take you to court, but it's not actually necessarily a crime in and of itself. And so in that sense, he's a good example of why con artists are often able to practice as long as they do, and get away with as much as they do, because it is actually very hard to police.
He would approach vendors via the estate agents. He would provide false reference details, that he was a professor, that he was a professor at Cambridge University, and that he'd just come back from the United States. He would fabricate his salaries, saying that he was earning in excess of £100,000 a year. And he would, on these references, he would provide a false person who would provide these references on the anticipation they would phone him up phone this person up to confirm the references. So consequently, these people phoning up Robert himself, where he would provide his own reference. And other than the initial deposit, he never did pay for the rent.
And in March 2005, Haims did exactly this to his final known victim, landlord Graham Smythe, the man who was vital in the con man's ultimate downfall.
A new tenant was found by the agent, who then rang me to tell me that they had found a new tenant and they had managed to get more money for the rental than, in fact, they had done before.
And Haims' carefree attitude to money was cleverly underpinned by his appearance of wealth and the impressive trappings associated with affluence, even though he had acquired them fraudulently.
When I met Mr. Haims, he seemed a genuine enough person. He would want to call you by a Christian name, want you to call him by his Christian name, to build up this rapport. He explained that he was a professor in biochemistry, and he was smart, is smart, presents a very good appearance, and if he can have a top-of-the-range car, etc., people look at others and appear to judge them by what they've got round them. And it succeeded where the agents were concerned, because when questioned, the agent said he was perfectly good because he was driving a Mercedes. He had all the appearances of wealth, but nothing.
Robert Haims cut an affable, friendly figure, but his professor persona was not enough to entirely convince Graham Smythe.
Robert Haims and his family appeared to only have 3 or 4 lounging chairs which you could purchase from a garden centre. And when I went to the house and saw this amount of furniture, I said, well, what's happened to your furniture? Oh, well, we have just come in from America. And, you know, the furniture takes a long time to arrive. So he's been here 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and there's no furniture? What is going on?
With niggling doubts, Graham Smythe turned detective and spoke to the letting agents.
So I tackle the agents and say, has the rent been paid? Oh, well, yes, the deposit's been paid. The deposit was paid in cash, which immediately starts to ring bells, because you think, who's running around with loads of cash? Have you had any further payments? No, but we're expecting one. Have you chased up the references? Oh, yes, we chased the references. Good references from a bank in America, etc., etc. However, it soon turned out that Mr. Haims had not paid his rent, had no intention of paying his rent, and although going round there and repeatedly asking him for the money, he would turn round and say, there must be a lack of communication. I cannot understand. I'm waiting for the money to come from my offshore account. He had got a plausible explanation, if he wanted to accept it, for every challenge that you put to him. But when you pressed him, how did he earn his money? Where did his income come from? He then started to backtrack and pull the, oh, I'm very ill, I don't want to go into this because of my heart problems, etc., etc.
But Haims' numerous excuses and attempts to sidestep Graham Smythe did not work. Graham started small claims court proceedings and went to the police, giving them the lead they needed.
I decided that he was not going to get away with it.
Coming up, DC John Gibbons catches up with the career conman, and Haims' conman charm means he comes perilously close to walking free.
I was starting to wonder whether he was right and I was wrong. And at some point, I had to shake my head and think, hang on a second.
Robert Haims compulsively conned on both sides of the Atlantic, living a luxurious lifestyle and pretending to be a leading university professor.
He's successful because he's got no morals. He doesn't care who he's stealing from. He has stolen from his family, including his own daughter.
He's playing a very dangerous game for a con artist.
His daughter started her college years thousands of pounds in debt.
Even once he was caught and then released on bail, he went on to commit something like 81 counts of fraud and deception.
He was an extraordinary conman, and certainly the best one I've come across.
Haims had been prolifically conning service industries, including estate agents, shops and car rental businesses. Haims was residing at a property where, in his usual style, he wasn't paying the rent. His landlord had called the police, and DC John Gibbons went and arrested the conman. And while searching the house, the shocking extent of Haims' crimes became clear.
It was obvious that they were in transit, because one of the bedrooms was full of boxes. You would say that they were never intended to stay there for any great length of time, because clearly they hadn't unpacked. And there were stacks and stacks of mail, and it was all red letter mail, all demands from solicitors, companies. There was a dozen to 20 letters arriving as we were there, all demands. We took all the paper from his house and we began to research everything that we'd got from there. And then I realised at that point that this was a fairly major criminal in relation to financial misconducts.
Awaiting trial and on bail for his failed 2002 Christie's con, Robert Haims audaciously committed a further known 81 offences in the UK during 2004 and 2005, scamming an alleged total of £68,500 from his prey. But in spite of proof that Haims was guilty, he was still not prepared to admit it when arrested on the 27th of May 2005 by DC John Gibbons.
He was in complete denial. We interviewed him for a couple of hours about what we knew him about. He was in denial. He was saying that where he'd bounced checks it was accidental. He wouldn't accept any of the allegations put to him at that stage.
And despite the overwhelming evidence, even when facing police questioning, Robert Haims was still a master manipulator. Even the most seasoned police personnel found themselves in danger of becoming bewitched by his twisted web of lies.
Each time I interviewed him, there was at some point where I was starting to wonder whether he was right and I was wrong. And at some point, I had to shake my head and think, hang on a second, he has done this. Despite what he's telling me, I know he's done it because I've got all these witness statements.
And as a detective, trying to sort of piece together movements over several years with somebody who's a consummate liar is very difficult, and you can find yourself almost getting drawn in. It's, quite understandable.
His whole life is built on lies. He's just a parasite that goes from flower to flower, picking up whatever he can, and then he moves on. He probably himself doesn't really know what is reality and what isn't. So he's probably quite convinced himself of some of the lies that he told.
In my experience, people will deny offences and continue to deny them until the evidence is so overwhelming they will reach a point where they will say, OK, fair enough, hands up, I did do it. It took a long time before he actually conceded that he had committed offences. And then it was on the proviso, well, I must have done if you said I did. But that wasn't good enough for me. Eventually he did fully admit to all the offences.
DC John Gibbons' hard work had paid off. He had Haims in custody and ended his conning rampage. The 81 offences John Gibbons painstakingly investigated were added to the Christie's case Haims was still yet to stand trial for. And in December 2005, Haims finally faced his many charges at Southwark Crown Court.
He accepted and asked for virtually all those offences to be taken into consideration, and which included his daughter, offences against his daughter, and he was convicted accordingly. The judge accepted the charges, and he received a lengthy custodial sentence.
Haims pleaded guilty to 10 charges and asked for a further 77 offences to be taken into consideration. These combined the charges for the Christie's con and the crimes DC John Gibbons tirelessly investigated. Haims was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for his prolific crimes, and before he was sent down, the judge said, "You seem to have almost a compulsion to try and trick people out of their money." He also made note that Haims' aim wasn't purely financial.
It's interesting, the judge's comments at the end of Haims' trial, because he did say he felt that Haims was getting not only financial benefit from these crimes, but also he got quite a kick out of it, and that's not unusual from conmen. Power and authority and being able to manipulate people is something that obviously gives them a great thrill. Now we're at the stage really with Haims that his family have deserted him. You know, he's implicated his daughter in a con. She sort of saw him for what he was. His wife has abandoned him. It'd be interesting. He's obviously at a crossroads now as to what he can do with his life.
Robert Haims started his 5-year sentence on the 20th of January 2006. This is not his first custodial sentence, and those who have encountered the con man fear that this is a story without redemption.
I got to know Robert quite well when interviewing him and dealing with him. He quite enjoyed the actual cons that he was doing. I'm not saying he didn't need to, because he wasn't working. He needed to carry on to continue with his standard of living, his lifestyle. But he quite enjoyed it, and I'm not convinced that time spent in prison will prevent him from doing it again.